It's March 2024, and teams of high school students from around Europe have descended on Italy to take part in the European Robotics Championship. The stakes are high. The best performers from this collection of students will punch their tickets to take part in the World Robotics Championships in Houston, Texas, a chance for these talented youngsters to get noticed and potentially go on to study in the United States. Lithuania sends 4 teams to participate. The Baltic state had already expressed its concerns with the championships because it allowed Russian teams to take part. They wrote in protest urging the event's organizers to ban the Russian students, only to find themselves roundly rejected. Still, they chose to take part. Why shouldn't they? This is their opportunity too, and they shouldn't refuse it simply because they would be competing against Russian students. Only they weren't competing. At least that was the case for 2 of the Lithuanian teams, Lituanica X and Litbot, that were told that to pass through to the World Championships, they would have to compete against other countries in alliance with the Russian teams. Those 2 Lithuanian teams refused. Instead, they raised their own nation's flag, along with the flag of Ukraine, at the competition to show their solidarity with Ukraine and their opposition to what they view as the Russian invasion of a country that should be independent. Lithuania's high schoolers bore a heavy cost for this act of protest. Despite the 4 teams being among the competition leaders, giving them a great chance to head to Houston, their refusal to work alongside Russia's robotics students led them to being docked points. Ultimately, they didn't qualify. But their refusal to work alongside Russia served as a microcosm of a trend that's been occurring since the war in Ukraine started: the derussification of the Baltic states. These 3 states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, are roundly rejecting Russian influence across the board. And in this video, we're going to ask the key question: why? To find our answers, we first have to start with a history lesson. On June 15, 1940, France's initial resistance to its Nazi occupiers finally crumbled. France fell, opening the door for Adolf Hitler and his regime to launch an attack on Great Britain. Though that event triggered the darkest days in Europe for many countries that were involved in World War II, Joseph Stalin and his Soviet cronies saw an opportunity to consolidate power while also building up the Soviet Union's defenses against the Nazi forces. Stalin sent an ultimatum to Lithuania, one of the 3 Baltic states that border the Baltic Sea and, at the time, one of the countries that could provide Stalin with a clear path into Finland. Stalin wanted Finland. He had already concentrated attacks on the country in an effort to claim it as Soviet territory, leading to his ultimatum to Lithuania being a simple one. It must form a government that was acceptable to the Soviet Union, in addition to allowing as many troops as Stalin wanted to move through the country on their way to Finland. Antanas Smetona, the president of Lithuania, quickly fled the country, leading to the installation of a people's government that granted the Soviets their access. Over the next couple of days, Stalin issued similar ultimatums to Latvia and Estonia, with similar results in both countries. The turnaround in the Baltic states was rapid. The communist parties in each country, which were previously extremely small and held little influence over the Baltics, suddenly became the most powerful political forces in the 3 regions. As for the Soviets themselves, they set about working with these parties to create a new regime, ignoring the constitutions each of the 3 countries had in place as they assimilated Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia into the Soviet Union. Property became nationalized. Mass deportations began, primarily focused on women and children who were sent to the most inhospitable desert and Arctic regions in the Soviet Union. All told, Latvia and Lithuania lost 35,000 people to these deportations, but Estonia bore the worst of it. The country lost 60,000 people. Those deportations continued even as the Nazis came knocking on the Baltic states' collective doorstep. At first, many in the Baltics considered the Nazis to be their liberators. They hoped that Germany would force the Soviet Union out, allowing each state to re-establish independent governments while also returning nationalized properties to their original owners. That isn't what happened. Germany instead turned the Baltic region into a new territorial unit, which it dubbed Ostland, and began a campaign of Nazification. Baltic support for Germany disappeared, with the 3 countries spending the rest of the war being fought over by Germany and the Soviet Union. They were little more than pawns in a global war, and the ravages of that war were made clear when it finally ended. Lithuania lost 15% of its population to the fighting, Estonia lost 25%, and Latvia, the worst affected of the 3, saw its population decline by 30%. Estimates place the total wartime and occupation deaths in the 3 countries during World War II at 520,000 people. The end of World War II brought no reprieve for the Baltic states. Rather than being granted their independence, each was made a Soviet republic, with Stalin working on integrating the three countries into the Soviet Union. Resistance movements existed, but they couldn't stop the march of Soviet industrialization. For the next 40 years, until the mid-1980s and the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Baltics were little more than states within the Soviet Union. Still, the 1980s brought change. Gorbachev attempted to reform the Soviet system during that decade, creating possibilities for the Baltic countries. Moscow's centralized power structure began to weaken, with mass movements such as the Lithuanian Movement for Reconstruction and the Popular Fronts of both Latvia and Estonia began fighting for change. They challenged the legality of the Baltic states' incorporation into the Soviet Union in 1989, prompting a huge demonstration that saw 500,000 people form a human chain linking Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia to protest against the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 that had allowed the continued occupation by the Soviets in the first place. Finally, 1990 brought with it true change. All three countries held proper elections for the first time in decades, with all three voting in pro-independence parties. As the Soviet Union collapsed, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia spent the 1990s establishing their independence once more. They formed new constitutions, created their own currencies, and started establishing relationships with other countries. The 2000s brought with them continuous economic growth, capped in 2004 when all three of the Baltic nations joined the European Union, or EU, and NATO. After around 60 years, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia could finally claim to be free of Russian oppression. Why does all of this matter? This history goes some way toward explaining why we're seeing what we're seeing in the Baltics right now, but it also explains the need for derussification in these states in the first place. Though they've been long free from the Soviet Union, all three countries still contain large Russian elements in various ways. But over the last 2 years, all three have started to reject those influences outright. We'll start with Lithuania, the home of the robotics teams that refused to collaborate with the Russian teams to win a competition that clearly meant a lot to them. Their single act of defiance is emblematic of a wider movement within Lithuania to rid the country of its Russian influences as much as possible. On a wider political level, Lithuania has been working to rid itself of Russian influence ever since the outbreak of war in Ukraine. For instance, Le Monde reported in April 2023 that Lithuania's parliament passed a series of amendments to its laws that placed extremely tight sanctions on any Russians who might attempt to claim citizenship in the country. Lasting for 1 year, those sanctions suspended applications for temporary resident permits and led to Lithuania outright refusing to accept any visa applications from Russian citizens except in the most exceptional of circumstances. Worse yet for prospective Russian immigrants, Lithuania's new laws also prevented them from buying property in the country for at least 1 year. So even those who make it into Lithuania may discover that they struggle to find somewhere to live. This isn't an example of Lithuania trying to remain neutral in a war that doesn't affect it. Instead, this vote was a clear message from the country that it supports Ukraine wholeheartedly. The immigration figures prove this, as Lithuania has accepted 75,000 Ukrainian refugees since the outbreak of war in February 2022, with 42,000 of those refugees having received temporary residence permits that will likely last for as long as the war continues. There's more. Beyond restricting Russian citizens' access to the country, Lithuania has also been working hard to weed out what it sees as risks to its national security. In August 2023, AP News reported that Lithuania declared a staggering 1,164 citizens of Russia and Belarus as threats to the country's security, with that declaration being accompanied by the stripping of permanent residencies of 1,164 individuals. The inclusion of Belarusian citizens in these numbers is also interesting. In fact, the announcement applies more to them than Russian citizens. 910 of the 1,164 are Belarusian, showing that Lithuania isn't just focusing on eliminating Russian influence from the country. It's also trying to rid itself of Russia's supporters. At the time of writing the script for this video, Lithuania is reaching the end of the initial year of sanctions mentioned earlier. The country's parliament is currently debating whether to extend the sanctions on citizenship and property ownership for a further year, having already rejected the restriction of free travel for Russians and Belarusians throughout Lithuania. Still, what we see here is a country that has drawn a clear line in the sand. Lithuania supports Ukraine. That much is obvious from the fact that the 128 members of the country's parliament united in declaring Russia's actions in Ukraine a genocide, essentially labeling Russia as a terrorist state in the process. It's also obvious from how ready Lithuania has been to welcome Ukrainian refugees, as well as from the level of financial and military support it's provided to Kyiv. In January 2024, Lithuania announced it would be sending a further $214 million to Ukraine, accounting for a little under a tenth of the country's entire military budget for 2024. Lithuania supports Ukraine so strongly that it's actively punishing Russians who attempt to move to the country. And it's not alone among the Baltic states, as we can see a similar opposition to Russian influence in Latvia. Like Lithuania, Latvia is imposing annual visa restrictions on Russian citizens who attempt to enter the country. It extended those restrictions in February 2024, with the country's foreign ministry announcing that Russians won't be allowed in the country until March 2025, unless they meet strict criteria. Those criteria include the ownership of an existing EU or Latvian residence permit, or that the Russian immigrant is a diplomatic staff member or the family of such a member. Latvia has also imposed sanctions against Russian citizens in the country, though it hasn't quite gone to the extent of Lithuania. For instance, April 2023 brought with it reports that the country implemented sanctions against 10 Russian people who were connected to the Kremlin's sentencing of a human rights defender named Vladimir Kara-Murza. Those 10 individuals received full travel bans, with Latvia's President Edgars Rinkēvičs going on to encourage the EU to place similar restrictions on the 10 people in question. Again, we see evidence of resistance against Russian influence throughout the country. And there's even more. In February 2024, Latvia became the first EU member state to impose a complete ban on agricultural products from Russia and Belarus. That appears to be a response to Russia essentially using the Baltic states' port infrastructure and grain storage capacity as a hub for its farming activity. Latvia clearly wants no part in helping Russian farmers profit from their products, with Latvia's decision meaning it will miss out on around 300 million euros of Russian imports annually until the ban is lifted. There's evidence that Latvia is trying to erase Russian culture from the country. Starting with the 2026-27 school year, Latvian schools will stop teaching Russian as a second language, with the schools instead asked to choose from one of the other official languages of the EU. So Latvia is in the derussification game for the long term. By eradicating Russian in schools, it will create a whole generation of Latvians who don't speak the language and thus can't or won't work alongside the Russian population in the country. And that's a large population. About 25% of Latvia's population of 1.8 million are ethnic Russians, with the move to ban Russian from schools sending a clear message to those existing citizens: you aren't welcome and your culture is being phased out. Like Lithuania, Latvia has also come out in staunch support of Ukraine during the war. It joined its fellow Baltic nations in declaring President Vladimir Putin's invasion a genocide, again meaning that Latvia is essentially treating Russia as a terrorist state. And like Lithuania, Latvia regularly sends military and financial aid to Ukraine. January 2024 saw Latvian President Edgars Rinkēvičs announce a new military aid package that he said would include howitzers, 155mm ammunition, anti-tank weapons, rockets, grenades, helicopters, drones, communication devices, generators, as well as other equipment. That's a pretty strong commitment, made even stronger by Latvia's decision to commit 1% of its GDP to supporting Ukraine. So Russia is 0 for 2 in terms of engendering any sort of support for its special military operation from the Baltic states. And the situation doesn't get much better for Putin in the Kremlin when we turn our attention to Estonia. In September 2022, Estonia banned entry into the country for all Russian visa holders who wish to visit for purposes related to sports, tourism, culture, or simply to visit family and friends. It went a step even further. Russians aren't allowed to enter Estonia even if they're only passing through on their way to another country. These restrictions are also in place in Latvia and Lithuania, as well as Poland, adding to those countries' restrictions on Russian citizens claiming residence. The move cut off Russian access to the Schengen zone, which is the world's largest free travel region. Created through a joint effort by France, Belgium, Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, the zone hosts 420 million people from 27 countries, 23 of which are members of the EU. Now Russian citizens can't pass through that zone, regardless of their visa status or whether they have a passport, which further restricts Russian movement throughout Europe. All thanks to Estonia. We're also seeing similar steps to those Latvia is taking in terms of eliminating Russian culture from Estonia altogether. For instance, in 2023, Hype and Hyper interviewed Andrei Makarievich, a Russian professor who lives in Estonia, who highlighted several changes he's seen since the war with Ukraine began. These changes include Estonia ending the availability of Russian radio and television programs, essentially ostracizing the Russian members of its population from the mainstream entertainment sector. Makarichev also highlights how attitudes towards Russians have changed since February 2022. He points out that the Estonian Russian-speaking community was afraid to be accused of being Russians because, when they realized what Russia did with Ukraine, they just saw huge negative feelings about Russia that might be projected onto them. A strange in-between situation arose, according to Makarichev. Though many Russians in Estonia outwardly wanted to show that what Russia did had nothing to do with them, he claims many still support Russia's foreign policies behind closed doors. That leads to division, both between native Estonians and Russians, and within the Russian community living in Estonia. The derussification keeps coming. In February 2023, Estonia's government tabled a proposal to unfreeze about $21 million of Russian assets in the country so the money could be used to support Ukraine. And speaking of support, Estonia has been just as ready to send aid to Ukraine as Latvia and Lithuania throughout the war. Assuming it follows through on its plans, Estonia will have provided $1.29 billion in military and citizen aid to Ukraine by the end of 2027. Oh, and it's also joined Latvia and Lithuania in calling Russia's invasion a genocide. Russia can see all of this happening, and it isn't happy about it. In February 2024, it announced that it had placed several Baltic states' officials on a wanted list for destroying monuments to Soviet soldiers within their borders. These officials include Kaja Kallas, Estonia's Prime Minister, and the Lithuanian Culture Minister Simonas Kairys. However, this seems to be a hollow threat. Though Russia has called the vague notion of destroying monuments a crime against the memory of the world's liberators from Nazism and fascism, it hasn't mentioned what charges, if any, those on its wanted list would face. Furthermore, Russia has responded to the Baltic states' travel bans with bans of its own. March 24 saw the country deny entry to 347 Baltic citizens, many of whom are high-ranking officials, or were formerly officials, in their home countries, citing hostile policy as the reason. It's attempting to fight fire with fire. But the reality is that Moscow has to look at a trio of countries that are among the most vocal in the world when it comes to condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. The Baltic states are derussifying at a rapid pace, which brings us back to the question that opened this video. Why? The answer, at least partially, lies in the history the Baltic countries have with Russia. The memory of Soviet oppression is still fresh in the minds of many in Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. It's only been 34 years since those countries were able to reclaim the independence that was taken away from them in the early 1940s, and there are still many in all three countries that can remember what life was like under Russian rule. Those scars are still fresh for many in the Baltic states. And it's the freshness of those scars that brings us to the main reason for derussification. None of the three want it to happen again. The Baltic states have been warning the rest of Europe about Russia and its intentions long before Putin decided to invade Ukraine. Sky News reports that 2 decades of warnings have gone ignored by NATO. The rest of Europe was more focused on the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan than they were on the developing situation between Russia and Ukraine in the 2000s and 2010s. This period also saw many countries in Europe, including Great Britain, reducing their stockpile of weapons that were seen as holdovers of the Cold War. Sky says that the UK in particular decommissioned tanks and reduced its stockpiles of ammo and artillery following the Soviet Union's collapse under the mistaken belief that the threat of a conventional war in Europe no longer existed. Even Russia's invasion and capture of Crimea, a precursor to the conflict we see now, didn't do enough to convince the rest of Europe that Putin presented a clear danger to Europe. All the while, the Baltic states were sounding alarms that were going unheard, resulting in the rest of Europe being shocked by Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. At least that's the opinion of Radosław Sikorski. As former Polish foreign minister, he spoke to Politico about the warnings that Poland and the Baltic states tried to issue to NATO over the 20 years before Russia's invasion. He notes that the nations to the east, those that border Russia or are close to it, ran into brick walls whenever they pled with NATO for increased troop deployments in their territory. Sikorski notes that they were all ignored when they started drawing attention to Russia's campaign of cyber attacks. Sometimes Sikorski took things further, such as when he compared the 2006 Nord Stream gas pipeline project between Russia and Germany to the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that divided his country between the Soviet Union and the Nazis. Sikorski may have gone a little too far with that comparison, but the sentiment was clear. Europe was ignoring the growing Russian threat. The Western Europeans pooh-poohed and patronized us for 30 years, he told Politico. They were patronizing us about our attitude. Oh, you know, you over-nervous, oversensitive Central Europeans are prejudiced against Russia. But perhaps that wasn't the case. Rather than Poland and the Baltics being prejudiced against Russia, they were instead issuing warnings because they understood Russia better than any other countries in Europe. all have been subject to the country's territorial claims, especially during the Soviet Union era, and perhaps they saw something in Putin's policies that nobody else did. Now they're in a position where they can say, "We told you so," to the rest of Europe and by extension NATO. And it's not like these warnings were unfounded. In 2007, Estonia's computer servers were hit with a massive distributed denial of service or DDoS attack that shut down private and public websites in the country. Estonia was essentially shut down for several weeks, with that shutdown leading to the deployment of around 1 million zombie computers that could help the attackers spy on Estonia's computing network. Estonia was convinced that Russia organized the attacks. But just as Sikorsky says, they were met with patronizing comments by the rest of Europe. That's according to Thomas Hendrik Ilves, Estonia's president at the time, who claims that the country's NATO allies told him that he didn't know what he was talking about and that he was simply being Russophobic. But the reality seems to be that these countries were seeing and reporting Russian warning shots, with their reports ultimately falling on deaf ears. It was only when Russia took the more direct action of invading an entire country that Europe and NATO started to pay attention. The Baltic states hope that both now have changed attitudes. That's because they see the risk that comes with a Russian victory in Ukraine. Should Putin succeed, they believe the odds are high that he's going to turn his attention to them. After all, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia have all been Russian territory before. To the Baltic countries, their efforts to derussify send a clear message to Putin that they don't want anything to do with him, Russia, or his efforts to strengthen his own country. But they also send a message to the Baltic's allies. We warned you about this before. Do something about Russia now, or we, and the rest of Europe by extension, may face even bigger problems in the future. Pro-Russian parties in these three states are now practically obsolete. All three are determined to keep Russians out and showcase their support for Ukraine. To the Baltics, the result of the war in Ukraine doesn't solely affect Ukraine, it affects them, and if the result doesn't go their way, they could be next in Moscow's firing line. But what do you think about the Baltic states and their derussification? Is it a justified response to Russia's actions that not only signals the Baltic states' desire to stay independent, but also highlights how much of a threat Russia poses to the three countries it used to rule? Or are the Baltic states making a huge fuss about nothing, as NATO and the EU seem to believe before the Ukraine crisis, and that Putin will stop once he has Ukraine? Tell us your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Russia will lose Kaliningrad, or click this other video instead.